Today we're going to have quite an exciting meeting. We have two main topics to cover. Before we get started, I'm going to start showing our antitrust policy notice. We show this at the beginning of every meeting to ensure that everyone is fully informed of our policy. You can find the complete policy on the website. And if you have questions, you can ask our antitrust counsel, Andy Updegrove. Now, this meeting, like all other global work team meetings, is open for free discussion. So please don't hesitate to jump in at any time with questions or comments. Mark is just after joining the call, and he will run the first section of this call, covering the specification. So Mark is the chair of the specification work group and is leading our future work around the standard. Mark, would you like me to hand over screen sharing to you?
Sure. You ready to do it now? Okay.
Sure. While Mark's getting ready to screen share, I will just tell people a tiny bit about our recent news. So last week, Microsoft announced ISO conformance, and today we had announcements from Hitachi and LG Electronics regarding their adoption of our ISO standard. So lots of news happening in the background, more announcements in the next few weeks. But over to Mark on specification 3.0.
Great, thanks, Shane. I'm going to take about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we can go on to the next topics. So the focus for that 10 or 15 to 20 minutes would be, again, briefly remind people of goals, see if any feedback about the current spec. We always want to make that an opportunity at this meeting for someone to come forward, and have that discussion. Obviously, there are other ways of providing feedback, such as the mailing list and the GitHub feedback page. And then also, I want to start this discussion that we've been having for a while about starting to add in additional areas for people to obtain additional conformance around trust around open source. So always a reminder to people that we have a number of resources that are specific to the spec. These are also, you can go to the main project page and get access to these as well. I always like to do a brief pause for anybody, even if you don't want to talk at length, if you have any particular feedback you want to offer up at this point about the current spec. Okay, that's fine. I'll assume that that means not for now. Okay, the next topic I wanted to switch over to was this idea of adding extensions to the spec. And one way to think about it is that there's this notion of, there's a lot of talk around building a bill of materials, particularly a more generic software bill of materials for a piece of software about all the parts. But we know from being in the compliance world that building a bill of materials for the open source pieces has always been an important step, and it's one of our core requirements of the spec. And I always consider that when you're dealing with trust around open source, that's the foundation. And so what we're starting to hear a lot of talk about security, export, and functional safety. And what I'm trying to highlight here is that we have an opportunity to expand the trust built on top of this bill of materials that we generate for license compliance, which is really the first pillar, right? We already do that with the spec, the first pillar. But these other three are places where we can add trust. And ultimately, the goal is to build trust around the use of open source. And that's always been the mission of the spec. And so this tagline is taken from the 2.0 title page of the spec, which we had to drop because of the transformation into the ISO format. But it's still our core, like vision, right? Establish trust in the open source from which software solutions are built. That's always been our mantra. So the basic idea is to take the current spec and allow us to start defining additional conformance areas that you can communicate trust to your supply chain by obtaining those. Now, I mentioned the three already: security, export, and functionally safe, or safety. But the thing I wanted to also start to entertain is this idea of taking an existing section of the spec, which is the fifth or the final or the fifth section, which talks about community engagement, which has always been a lighter version of the spec, and move it out and make it possibly one of our first optional pieces. And I'll explain why that I don't see that as a big problem. Even if people are already conforming with the spec and you happen to remove something from the spec, that still keeps you conforming. In fact, it's just easier to conform, right? And this has always been a section that's always been kind of a little of an oddball section, which has a real importance. But not every organization is at a place where they're regularly engaging with the community, but there are others that are. And if you want to convey that kind of trust, then there's an opportunity to have a more deeper set of requirements around that without affecting the main spec, without impacting those. So the idea would be you can still go to the spec, satisfy all the requirements, and get the conformance badge as you see on the left side. Then the idea would be for each of these to generate an additional badge that you have an option to choose. So for example, if you want to convey to your suppliers that you also have a very disciplined process, not only around license compliance, which is at the core of the spec, but also you are doing that for security parts of open source as well. So their trust around open source goes up even more, right? And then if you want to also convey the sense of export, that means in each of these, you have a program that follows a certain basic set of requirements that gives your customer the comfort that you're doing the right things and handling that. And we'd have to discuss what those are. We would create a document for each one of these and start trying to identify what we would consider the basic core requirements of each of these programs. Like what's the core requirements of a community engagement program, right? Again, it's never to be prescriptive. It's only to be more focused on the general what, the how and the what and why, sorry, and not the how and when, right? And the same thing for security. What are the basic core things you'd like to, and we always start out with the minimum and we always can add on more, but what are the basic core minimum things you expect someone to be doing with their program around vetting open source? Okay. And then there's export, and then there, I'm sorry, the last one should have been safety. I did a little typo here. But again, one thing I wanted to point out here is the bill of materials has always been core to the spec, and license compliance is built into the spec. And the reason why it's there is because you absolutely have to comply with the licenses in order to distribute your product. If you're not complying with the licenses, you haven't secured the freedom to distribute your product. So that's the core. It's always at the core. And in order to do that, you have to build a bill of materials. What's interesting, though, is that bill of materials is important to all of these other optional activities. And I think we can play that instrumental role in ensuring that that bill of materials is created in the first stage, right? The base foundation stage. And then that can be utilized in each of the others. I'm going to pause for a second because this is, I think, where we want to start to go with the spec. Any thoughts, any concerns, any confusion? Are we doing that?
I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, I'm very much in favor of that.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to bring up is I think it's a good thing that we took the community management off of the core foundation and made it optional, because that
we haven't done it yet. But what you're saying is you're in favor of doing that, is what you're saying.
That's right. So I mean, again, from my end, like our organization, we do have both inbound and outbound. The community engagement, I see it as more of a outbound contributions that go out from my organization to the open source community, how we manage that. So at my organization, we do have a complete set of processes and systems and guidelines that basically incorporates that. However, I can see that there are certain organizations which may not necessarily contribute that much as much as they leverage. So I think having that kind of flexibility to some of the relatively organizations that are just trying to adopt this new specification, I think having that flexibility, I think, is really going to be helpful.
Sure, that's helpful to hear. And I
One
think that,
aspect that I just wanted to bring up here is, I mean, I know you've covered a really good like overall export compliance and functional safety. Just one other piece that I was kind of, again, this just crossed my mind was, when are there any governmental compliance, right? So sometimes, when you do some sort of like FedRAMP, or
Mhm.
different organizations, different government have their own compliance. So is there something that we can add value there, bring in like governmental compliance or government regulations into this, and that will be another pillar that potentially can be built on that? Is that possibility?
Sure. In fact, we're creating this model for scalability, and that would be a perfect thing that we can then say, once we got good at these others, or at least one of the others, right? Adding any additional ones, such as government, would make a lot of sense. That's exactly, we're kind of reorganizing for that kind of ability to enable that if there was enough interest.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I think when it comes to uh, these, the community part, I think, is one area we can go pretty. I don't want to say quickly. We can move right now and start that. We can start the security. I think we can get a lot of maturity quickly on the community part, because we have some experience with it already. And it might be the first one we just do. Like, we don't have to do all four, right? We don't need to boil the ocean at the moment. We can go with the community engagement as the first one to test out this optional ability, and start to draft. The security probably is a natural one to start to draft as well. And if we have people who are interested in the export, they can start to each of these, but we don't need to deliver them all at once. And maybe the very first one is the community engagement.
Hey, Mark, Dave Marr here. This looks really interesting to me. I think you're proposing to start off to gather data, not necessary to ask to make a decision right now
Correct.
on these aspects. Okay, so if in terms of the data gathering, are you looking for formality around that? To sort of like do a study, if you will, on a given item, or are you looking for more informal feedback and maybe anecdotal case studies or other things?
It's a good question. How are we going to go about to validate this? Does it make sense to invest energy here? I think the approach I was thinking was a little bit on the more informal side, where we just like we started with the OpenChain spec in the earliest days, we had some kind of like wiki editor, and we just got a bunch of people together and everybody started inserting all these kinds of ideas. I'd create one of those for each of these areas and just see what kind of, first of all, we need to have the expertise come, right? People who feel that they're competent in helping define these there's participation, right? Without that, we can't really do it. And then the other thing is we don't necessarily have to ever release, we can continuously evolve this, but only if we start to get a lot of pull to do it, right? Then we actually release it. So for example, we could very well start, drafting some of these in there. Some of them will be in more mature stages than others, but we may never get to the point where we're committed to saying these are definitely going to be optional. Maybe the more open question would be, are there any other potential optionals that we want? And just having a framework which will enable that when we become more aware of them, I think is important. Just having that framework in place.
And Mark, this is Jeff here. I think another place is we can look over at the Finos Foundation, which is part of Linux Foundation, around kind of the financial side and the highly regulated industries in the financial world. In the vertical there.
Yeah, I mean, if you're starting to see that when you're delivering solutions to them, and they're starting to ask you for certain contractual terms or guarantees or warranties, I find that's a natural validation of a need for putting together some, requirements that convey trust around open source with respect to those things. I think that'd be a natural thing to do. And back to Dave's point, one of these things that will drive this, will validate these. We're really in a kind of, we haven't validated any of these, is to move forward and to see what kind of pressures people are being given in especially when they're negotiating software contracts.
Hey, one aspect that I just wanted to get clarification on the community engagement. So are there, I mean, we are going to have the specification just abstract or provide a high level abstract at the process level, right? So in terms of how the implementation of these process exists, like, obviously that will vary from organization to organization, correct? Like, so in general, like
Correct.
say, if I wanted to have a contribution done, just the approval process itself, different organizations can follow different approval flows to get that community engagement going. So you only going to have the specification, keep it at the abstract, like the process level, and then leave it up to the individual organizations to do the respective implementation, right?
That is correct. In fact, that's exactly the process or the method we took with the actual core spec today, right?
Okay.
It's the what and why. We always emphasize, we focus on the what and why, not the how and when. And then we would follow the same principles. These are high level principles. I always describe it like when someone's looking to purchase a home, they may tell a realtor, I'm looking for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. And that fits a lot of homes, right? That's what your top level, high level requirements are. There are many ways of satisfying that. There are many homes that will satisfy that. That's the same idea here. We'd have a very high level set of core requirements you expect. Let's say when it comes to community engagement, you expect any good, mature, or disciplined organization around community engagements. There's certain core things that you expect that they have. They're very high level requirements, but there are many ways of implementing those requirements.
Okay, that makes sense.
Anybody have either some reservations or they just don't think this is very interesting to them or their organization? But back to David's point, we're not committing. This is not a all out commitment to go. It's to move on to the next stage, to start gathering up, information from the experts from each of these and seeing if how they start to evolve and if we get enough people to participate and come in and offer and contribute. That's our first stage of, I guess, validation. Second stage would be then to go out and determine if there's a real need or caring for this.
And then
I mean,
by that,
you say, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, no, go ahead, Andrew. Sorry.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the, I think as sort of Mark was saying, one of the strange things about the community engagement section was that it's always essentially been optional, because it's always been possible to put in there, we don't get involved. Our policy is that we don't engage with communities. Right. I mean, I've never come across that actually being implemented in practice, but in theory you can do that. So and I've always explained this to people when they've asked about it and said, well, essentially this really is it's almost an attempt at social engineering, in that what we're trying to do is we're trying to make people think about community engagement. If they're not already, then we're trying to make them think about it. So I think first of all, removing this from in the next version of specification, allowing a framework for this to be more carefully defined, I think is very helpful for that particular goal, because I think then it focuses people's minds even further on the fact that community engagement is something that they should be considering. But it also meshes quite neatly with the fact that actually it is the one optional part of the fundamental specification in the first place. So for those two reasons, I very much support this.
Yeah, and I think this might be the one place where we do go and we probably get closure maybe, and actually because we see a benefit to making it an optional piece, and maybe we don't get to the other three right away or years from now, but that will create the framework, this optional idea. It's almost like demonstrating our ability to execute on creating an optional piece. And I think working with community engagement, it's a good chance that we can succeed at that one, given your experiences. And there is still, it's still highly complementary to the current spec. It's not going away. It's just getting put in a slightly different place, and it's going to really serve that optional role it was intended to serve in the first place, or not that it was intended to serve, but how it works today. Okay, kind of near the end of my 20 minutes for this meeting. This is we'll probably the next steps would be to take the community engagement section and start kind of piloting that, trying to start forming a set of requirements, building on what we already have in the spec, from the spec, right? And see if we could add a few more items there. Would probably be the next step on doing this exploration. Okay. And again, we'll continuously go and listen to people as they're trying to adopt the spec. And if at the core piece, we'll still continue to, we'll come back to those discussions, but I want to get some of these going and kind of start getting some parallel feedback going. All right, with that, Shane, I'm done.
Awesome. So I will grab the screen share
Yeah.
again.
Let me stop it.
Perfect. Now, the next section is where we get prepped for some super interactive stuff. The education work group has been working on an online training course. We are going to produce this training course in partnership with LF Training. It will be hosted on the edX platform, which has an audience of 35 million people, and it will be easy and free for people to sign up and take the course. To get the course running, we have begun to create a folder online which contains the information that the LF training team wants from us. I'm just going to put the link into the chat. We're using, in this particular case, Microsoft's OneCloud or OneDrive, because this is something that allows us to share material into China as well. If you open it up, there's a folder called Course Content, and there's a document called Course Content. Let me give you the direct link to that document in the chat. Oops. I have now placed that into the chat, and it should open a document that looks like this. Now, with this link, you have the ability to edit the document. And that's what I would like to put out a call for today. Currently, the document is being filled out with the material from our pre-existing slides. We don't need to do anything fancy. LF Training is perfectly happy to take this document and make it into the edX course for us. What we do need is to have a look at the document, look at the material. It's been a while since we reviewed the training material, and see if we need to clarify, add, expand, and so on. Right now, the first 4 chapters are in the document. And if you sign in, if you open it up, you can see that the basic format is exactly the same as before, with the only particular change being that the check your understanding has been consolidated to the end. I'm just scrolling down to the end so that we have the beginning of a free-form examination to see how people understand the whole training course. And you can see I've begun to add comments and questions. For instance, I'm questioning, where do we want to keep it free-form? Do we want to make the answers to these questions multiple choice so it feels more intuitive for an online training course? And this is exactly the type of comment I would love you to both make and add to as we go through the material. I'm going to give you some examples of other comments I made. Here's one. This is the chapter Key Concepts for Open Source Review. And
Shane, if you're trying to share like a live screen of a browser window, all I'm seeing is that link still on my screen.
let me redo that. Thanks, Dave. 1 second. All right.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. I'll just review from the top. Thanks, Dave. So this document contains the information that we have in the slides, the first 4 chapters at the moment. The material is structured in precisely the same manner, with the one major change being that Check Your Understanding has been moved to the bottom and consolidated into an exam. My first comment here is that we may want to change this into multiple choice questions instead of free-form answers to make it more intuitive for online training. Going up a bit, here's another example of a comment. This is in the key concepts for open source review about how we use components. As we talk about incorporation, linking, modification, and so on, we have some basic images to illustrate those concepts. So this image highlighted on the screen right now is incorporation. And the question is that sufficient? I put a note, do we think these images are correct to describe things like incorporation? And do we need more images either in this chapter or elsewhere throughout the first 4 chapters? We may want to make the course a little bit more punchy on the image style and also put in images to assist with non-native speakers. For example, this is incorporation, this is linking, this is modification, this is translation, and this is development tools, how they work from a very high level. As you can see, we have a lot of potential to mess around with this stuff and to come up with great ideas. And as we go through it, we're going to have some interesting questions related to current developments. For example, in chapter 2, we're talking about open source licenses, and we had a section about non-open source licensing situations. But this was written before the development of new licenses by companies like MongoDB. So do we need to revisit this section? Do we need to have a better description of the new licenses coming to market that may be misunderstood as open source? I'd argue probably yes. So we need people to jump in and add suggestions and comments to that to talk about how we can accomplish it. Indeed, you'll notice that, for instance, our proprietary or closed source licensing section is quite neat and tidy. Our other non-open source licensing situation is quite sprawling, and it continues. I think that might be where we put the everything else category, and we could probably work out a better way to display this.
Yeah, I think that, just a quick comment, I think there's a need to possibly have a way of describing licensing in a more general sense. I know we don't want to go down this path too much, but tonight. But for example, I always think of, we now have accumulated a list of 1,500 licenses we're identifying in open source, right? Well, people like it'd be patchy at the top, but there's a half a dozen or a dozen licenses easily inside, right? And I guess the term I'm coming to grips with is these are open licenses. They openly give you the right to use the stuff. They might be proprietary free, right? But they might be the more traditional open source, such as the GPL. But I think there's some opportunity here for us to organize licensing a little bit more with respect to the basic concepts to have this all fit more cleanly. I understand this is like a first pass at trying to organize licensing, but I think there's an opportunity here for us to even add more value in giving crisp categories that will accommodate all the stuff we're seeing in the wild. Anyway.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, I concur with that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
From my perspective, I think, yeah, this section can also shed some light on, I think some like, Shane, you just mentioned about MongoDB, and quite recently, just a few days back, the announcement that came out of Elastic, for example, right? Where they're moving into, from Apache 2.0, they're moving into a more restrictive SSPL. So that aspect, I think, can be potentially covered, because I know the messaging from the organizations have been quite like, SSPL is relatively open, but then there is also the aspect of, there are other aspects to cover when somebody's moving into that license. What are the impacts that potentially a paid service can have for organizations, right? That is using that newer versions. So I think that shedding some light on some of these newer, adoption of licenses for some of these widely used products and services can be covered in this section. I think that will be really helpful for organizations to kind of clearly weigh in and see, does it really make sense to chart that path or some other path that they need to take in the future, right? So that might be something that, you know, I just wanted to share here.
Andrew, I think you had a note as well.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to make a sort of comment about the overall structure, because I mean I think so. For example, you know, we're getting into some fairly extreme detail here as far as the licenses are concerned, and this is all really important stuff. But I think, you know, this is something that you would normally expect to see on an intermediate or an advanced course. And I think some thought needs to be given to the overall hierarchy of this, because one of the bits of work that we did in the template open source policy was to basically map the levels of training required against each of the defined roles. So if your defined role is, for example, that you're marketing open source software, then you really don't need to know the effect of the SSPL. But on the other hand, you know, if you're involved as a coder who makes coding selections, then that's something that you do need to do. So what I would be quite keen to see is a sort of hierarchical structure that you know, starts with an introduction to the topic, and that's suitable for people with some roles, and then you have an intermediate and advanced levels for people with different roles as well. As I say, we've gone through quite a lot of this sort of thought process already in the template open source policy, but I think it'd be quite nice to see a sort of structure like that. You know, it also means that you know, you're directing the training at the areas where it's most needed, and it's, you know, I think the information that we have in the slide deck and in this document is fantastic. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I have something like 168 slides or something, which is absolutely, you know, fantastic. But I don't think it's necessary for everyone who is involved in a compliance program to be you know, fully au fait with all 168 slides. I think some people are obviously going to have to delve into greater depth in some areas than others.
That's a really good point, and it's probably particularly visible, for instance, in this introduction to open source licenses, which contains a huge drop of information. So you might want to take a chainsaw to the core. And then
I mean, the slide deck, it almost reads like a reference manual, like a very detailed one. And to Andrew's point, we do something similar, just an organization. We don't have a policy per se broken out, but we have different quizzes, right? So we have our program managers who manage programs. They have a higher level. They don't need to have all the complexity. We have a marketing, you know, people. And then we also, obviously we have engineers, and there's 3 different quizzes they have to, depending on their function, right? They take because for that very reason. And what we do is that we have 3 different trainings to allow them. We actually don't require them to take the training. We just require them to pass the test. But that's just our approach. But I agree with you that there needs to be some way of identifying that there are multiple groups here. Otherwise, this looks overwhelming.
And you know, more broadly, we have a terrific opportunity for the global community, as we mess around with this, to come back to the training slides and have them benefit as well. I just saw Jeff unmute. Jeff, did you have a note?
Yeah, I was, you know, having just been onboarded in a company, and you know, you get a lot of training the first month or 2 that is mandatory, and some is 2 hours and some is 15 minutes. And I think to kind of echo some of the comments I heard, you know, with the different levels, you know, maybe there's a, you know, good, better, best level, and we need to look and say, is there a 15-minute 15-minute quiz, half an hour quiz, 1 hour quiz, 2 hour quiz, whatever the appropriate intro is, that makes it a little bit more palatable to organizations when they say everybody needs this, everybody needs to pass level 1. And if it's an hour quiz, that's not as palatable as if it's a half an hour quiz or a 15-minute quiz. And you know, and different people are gonna have different reading levels and education levels and whatnot. But just the thing to think about here, you know, we set it as 10, you know, what is our best 10 questions or 10 slides, and fit the level 1 training to be that, with the understanding that we're not gonna, we can't teach everybody everything in that first level. But I do remember in one of our early OpenChain questions, you know, someone from a large company said, I have, you know, tens of thousands of developers, and if I multiply their training by 2 hours each, that's you know, $1 billion, and I can't afford that. You know, come back with a shorter education plan.
That's actually a really good point. And we should emphasize here that these slides are very, very flexible. You know, we can go crazy here making these slides optional. So I'll just give you a quick example. If you think a section should be cut out, we could simply do that. We can just note it. So with other open source licensing situations, we could just tag that and just say, this can be moved. Optional, by way of example. I'm not sure if you think that'll work. What do you all think? Would that be something workable, or would it be too goofy? Be careful, because silence means you support it.
Yeah, I would tend to classify each of the topics or slides, whichever way you want to look at it, as a different level. So, you know, when we're getting into the nitty gritty, so I'm not allowed to say that anymore. When we're getting into the depths of licensing, then, you know, if you define that as intermediate or advanced, then that basically means that then there's a gap for a sort of basic licensing set of slides. So I'm sort of envisaging it more like a sort of, almost like a sort of graph database, starting at the top and sort of working its way down through sort of levels of you know, depth of information. I mean, my old physics teacher always used to describe education as being a sort of process of diminishing deception. So you start out at the very basic level, and then sort of gradually say, well, okay, we've said that, but that's not always true. There are these exceptions, and then you move into the exceptions. But the advantage of looking at it like that and trying to break each individual sort of learning module down into a sort of small bite-sized chunk, if that's possible, of sort of, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, something like that, also means that certainly at the basic levels, then at a later stage, we can think about whether we want to use, you know, other more accessible media to convey those. So you might have a sort of, you know, a sort of top level video, for example, which can then be published on YouTube and elsewhere, that people can very easily see, that echo these. You wouldn't necessarily want to put all the effort into doing that for the more advanced stuff. So it just allows greater flexibility, I think, if we look at it that way.
Okay. Just making a note here.
Okay.
Awesome.
Shane, this is Dave. I agree with all the prior comments, you know, that, you know, to answer the question of how one must sort of revise and, you know, scope the design of this set of materials, we all have to sort of start with an assumption of what is the level of the person that is being trained? What sort of scaffolds do they need in order to get to the next piece? And what is sort of that paradigm? Are they coming from it from no knowledge, some rough knowledge? Are they technical or, you know, not so technical? Are they, you know, legal or not really, you know, legal? So that's, you know, it's hard without sort of those assumptions to actually make all the right design choices here. But I'm also coming at this from a little bit of the, you know, the mindset of, if I'm a partner in the business of, let's say, delivering training, how am I looking at this? And, you know, I think that the answer is that, you know, to think of this as almost like a ongoing deployed, you know, wiki in the training format, of course, that has this deployed training aspect of it, but it really doesn't have anything bespoke, anything customized for a given client. So if a partner wants to train, let's say, for an automotive customer or client, or train in a certain geography, or train, you know, given some time envelope, you know, you've got to get this training done within 30 minutes. So, and the training audience is, you know, going to be software engineers. You know, it's a different set of selection, and one can still take these materials under the CC0 license and, you know, and make it their own and make it appropriate for that pre-existing knowledge of the trainees. and their background, and it can add color, maybe relatable use cases. Automotive is going to have different use cases than, let's say, mobility on, cell phones or stuff. So I think that this should be kind of branded as a great and improving generic course, but also think of it as a raw materials repo that can be used by any company or any partner. And so a partner should be comfortable investing their effort into this, knowing that OpenChain is not going to try to go all the way to the very, very last point and take out the training market.
Yep. That makes sense. And we are not limited, I understand, on edX in terms of being able to update this. And it's entirely possible that this format with this single file that we can all easily edit can be the single source of truth for our reference material going forward. And we build our slides and so on out of this. But yeah, we simply can't compete with professional providers, and we don't intend to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
Great point, Dave. And just out of curiosity, everyone, did anyone try to access the link and did it work okay for you guys? The second link.
So this is Jeff. I was able to see X separately, and I your comments. Wait a minute.
Shan is working.
Hi. Great. So, yeah, that's my request. Great, we have confirmation it's working. My request is that everyone takes a few minutes to take a look at this. And, on this call, we have approximately 15 minutes more scheduled. And if people could open the document and just take a 5-minute look at it right now, that will be super useful. And then we can all give back 10 minutes of our time for later in the evening. But that will be my request. If you can open this document, have a quick look. And if you have any framing comments, just drop them at the top. If you have any quick comments at the inside, just drop them there. And we just take a couple of minutes to begin that process today, and that will be super useful. I'm just going to go quiet for 5 minutes, and then I'll be back so everyone has time to open up.
Just one little comment here that the document, once you are in edit mode, it looks quite a bit different than just in the view mode. So be aware.
And of course, just so everyone knows, the link will allow edit access. So there should be no problem to switch to editing mode.
On my system, it looks better in editing mode. There was some formatting issues before.
Yes, indeed. Because I was first at the view mode, and when I saw what Shane was sharing, I was like, oh, like this looks, quite different. But yeah, in edit mode, it's much better.
Mm-hmm.
We're having some great comments on the document already, which is very nice. One thing that came up is to work on triaging different levels in the slides. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes on the call is to begin suggested triage. It would be super for those of you who are in the right time zone if you could continue. And meanwhile, if you have any comments or questions, let me know. I will pause here as well in case we have any other business on the call. If someone wants to discuss another work team, an event, other news, it's perfect time to do that now. Okay, I'm going to have a little bit of a look at the level triage, which I think could be an interesting concept which was brought up. So for instance, oh, go ahead. Oh, someone had just unmuted by accident. I wonder if we should use color coding for the different levels. I don't know. Ah, Marcel jumps in. Ah, interesting point from Marcel. The suggestion that we do have levels, but in some chapters, we might need the exact same content, but with a different fidelity, different size of the content. That's an interesting point, Marcel. That might require some re-editing of chunks of the text, but I think that's fine. To try and do that somewhere for fun on the screen share. So Marcel, I'm going to scroll down where the text gets, ooh, lots of notes are appearing. I'm going to scroll down to somewhere where the text gets pretty hefty. Maybe chapter 3 somewhere. Okay, so I'm going to mess with this obligations, compliance obligations. And I'm going to split it in two, with one example being the simple version. One example being the full version. So in this case, I'm not actually going to touch the level 2 text. I'm going to focus on making the level 1 shorter. And for this, I'm going to just chop out text. And then it will be subject to criticism about whether we've chopped out too much. So in this case, what I'm doing with all of this chopping is hypothetically creating a situation where we've covered all of the core issues at play with the level 1 without going into detail, and then people can get detail on level 2. Prasad just said he's going to have a look at the text a bit later. He's dropping off. Well, obviously in Pacific, it's really late right now.
I'm wondering if actually putting this into a spreadsheet might work better, because then, so we could basically have sort of first column being topics, second column being the introduction for each topic, so level 0, level 1, level 2, and then we can just sort of move the text over a column if we feel that it's more advanced than is necessary for the column that it's under at the moment. I mean, I'm sort of fairly loath to suggest we completely restructure the whole thing, but I just feel that's, I don't know, it just feels like the sort of the best way of capturing the structure, basically.
How about using Jira or Trello or tool like this, and you can just make different columns like level 1, level 2, level 3, and then move basically the, well, what's normally is the task, but in this case it could be the, let's say, the slide.
Yeah,
if you
that's
use
a possibility.
Trello board or Jira, Kanban board basically, or whichever tool you fancy.
Yes, yeah. Can you export Kanban into a spreadsheet? I just thinking in terms of being able to move from one sort of format to another. That's my only slight concern about that. I mean, certainly sort of moving things is easier on a Kanban board.
But we do have a challenge that if we are using another system, we have to be absolutely certain it works in China.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
But for example, Jira Cloud, I don't know. That could be possible.
We can definitely look into it.
Yeah.
So in the short term, everyone.
Sorry.
In the short term, everyone, please proceed on this document, and I will also explore our other options for what we can do here to maybe make it even easier. So Andrew, I think it's fundamentally a good idea, but I'll have to check with people to make sure they're comfortable with it, as opposed to just working on this document. And whatever we do,
absolutely.
It's going to have to land back in this document for LF training, because that's the only way they'll ingest what we do.
Yeah.
All righty. So this is an example of working on the layers and just high-level concept. Maybe this is a manager level, and this is project leader level. And this is just put here to get that ball rolling. It's not locked in stone by any measure, to show how we could go with the onion concept. So comments and suggestions right there, super welcome. Everyone, this has been incredibly important. And just going up here, look at all these comments we have. We have a ton of great material already to suggest how to improve this. And that is going to be really useful. Even if we decided pretty much to run with what we've got now, by incorporating these comments and suggestions, we already have a much better reference training course than before. So every minute you put onto this is going to pay a lot of dividends to the community. All right, awesome suggestions. I've got some action items. Thank you, everyone. Brilliant call, and talk to you in a couple of weeks.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.